Hello and welcome to today's Podcast Plus, bringing you insight for best practice in bite-sized chunks. Today we're picking up on a breakout session of our most recent podcast, which was home working and remote working arrangements for law firms. And the microcosm we're going to pick up on today is managing supervision and file reviews, which we know is a big concern in the, post-COVID world that we're operating in. My name is Neil Partridge, I'm the Operations Director at PDA Legal, and I'm joined again today by my colleague Samantha Aldridge, who is a Director at P&P Hub.
Hello, Neil.
Samantha, give us some idea of the context of this.
Okay, so we've been looking at the kind of regulatory requirements of supervision and file reviews in the SRA code, and there's three kind of key points, I think. The main overarching principle, I suppose, is that you have an effective system for supervising client matters. So that's very, very important. But there are two others that refer to supervision. So you need to ensure that the individuals you manage are competent to carry out their role. And that's in the Code of Conduct for Solicitors. And where you supervise or manage others providing legal services, you remain accountable. So I think it's really, really important to have a strong supervision and file review process during remote working, as it's ever been when you've been in the office. So that leads us on to what are some of the challenges. And I think, what have you been seeing, Neil, or what firms are possibly experiencing? And I think capacity, when you're working remotely, you can lose sight of individuals' capacity.
I agree, Samantha. Capacity is a big issue, and you're very right, because it's very easy to, when you're outside of the office environment, to understand what people are doing, how they're working, where they're finding things challenging. And of course, applies to support staff too. You can have a very happy team of fee earners, but the support staff may be rather overworked or indeed underworked. Linked to that, there's capacity and the way work is being picked up and handled in terms of client care and complaints. And there's opportunity.
Yeah.
There's certainly opportunity and threat in that context. Let's think about complaints that could arise due to slow service or due to insufficient advice, for instance. But there's a flip side to that. There's opportunity there as well. If you're unaware or you're not effectively monitoring capacity, might you have fee earners who have capacity you didn't know about, who could actually be taking more instructions? Certainly, I am seeing in the field there are some firms that are actually busier than they've been for a long time, as clients have come back in certain areas of law and they've realised they do actually have the capacity to deal with that. But you have to know you have or don't have that capacity. There's risk of over-independence. That is a real challenge. There's also things like file reviews. What if you only review in hard copy normally? How are you going to deal with that? How are you managing the risk on those files? Could you be reviewing less or more frequently in some cases? How are you going to deal with corrective action? And linked to that, and if you like, some of the things we have to normally do or would perhaps normally do or often do on paper, what about things like signatures, where you've got to have a signature or internal record of a signature on a matter file? Pretty challenging stuff, and I think we've got some top tips coming for these, haven't we?
Yeah, I mean, we thought about this long and hard, and I think there's kind of overarching practical considerations how to make this work, and there's 5 key points. So I think keep collaborating and working as a team, especially if you work in an open plan office normally. It's very easy to work as a team. You learn about what everybody's doing. You can pick up things really easily. So try to keep that. Utilize technology where appropriate. Agree ways of working between supervisor and supervisee, but also between colleagues. I think you need to be ready to build in flexibility due to personal or business circumstances, but it's really, really critical to sustain an open door policy, even when working remotely. I think there may be a tendency when you're working remotely to kind of just get on with things. You don't want to pick up the phone and disturb other people that are working. It's very different to just turning around in your chair in the office, but you kind of need to still keep that team working and collaboration that you would have had possibly in the office, hopefully. So I mean, this bringing us back to our previous podcast, what does this mean for the remote working policy, though?
So perhaps the thing to do here is to those if you like 5 practical overarching points you've raised there, Samantha. Firms that get those in order will find their house is brought into order. But it's very important to look at the remote working policy. Is it still functioning? And then not necessarily to revise your remote working policy to then double up on your supervision and file review policy. You've already got one of those. The SRA, as we talked about before, doesn't necessarily specify how your supervision has got to work, but it does say people have got to be effectively supervised. You've got those policies in place already. but they might need to be reviewed. We've got some top tips coming up for those. But how does that dovetail back into your remote working policy? Well, having reviewed your file review policy, having tested it, and then maybe re-reviewed it to see, is it still effective? Perhaps then you can refer back to your remote working policy and say, okay, make sure, guys, everybody knows what they're supposed to be doing for supervision and file reviews, and make a mention of that in the policy. And I go back to something I
Mm.
said last time our last podcast, was it's not necessarily a bad idea considering the risk involved, and there is risk involved and opportunity in so much remote working taking place. It's well worth considering maybe having every member of staff, whenever you do a review on the policy, or at least once a year for remote working, to get them to read and to sign it to say they've read and understood it. And that way you know, in theory, you know that they have then gone back and reflected upon the other policies that are dovetailed or mentioned within the remote working policy. So yes, make sure that your supervision and file review forms as well, make sure they're reviewed. So it's not just about the policy, it's also looking at the other forms that are affected. So maybe your risk assessment forms, maybe your conflict of interest procedure and forms. How are they working remotely? In light of the undoubtedly new way that some firms are going to be working.
Yeah, so make it work for you, isn't it? It's reviewing the policies and procedures and the forms that you use and making it work for this new environment.
Very much so. And bear in mind as well, as we know, that the 2019 SRA code wants to see evidence that you are achieving compliance. So having a form that is out of date is not very good evidence. So Samantha and I have got our heads together on this one, and we've come up with some hot top tips that you might like to consider. So we would say, first of all, risk assess where you are. I know you've already done this. All firms have done this recently, but do it again. Keep an eye on it and risk assess your people. Who needs what? How are they working? How often are they remote working? What support do they have? Risk assess your matters. Are there some matters that are just too risky to be left outside the remote environment, or what measures do you need to put in place to keep them under a tight monitoring? And also your systems, are they effective? Are they working? Are your plans, policies and procedures still reflective of the systems you're actually using right now? Bear in mind that if there was a problem, or if there was a complaint or a breach or something like that, you might need to rely upon evidence that your systems are working effectively to show that you were trying to avoid the problem in the first place. Consider as well, and look at your policies for this, look at your remote working supervision policies, look at your file review policies, look at your client care policy. How should colleagues be available to each other? Like Samantha's already said, don't be afraid to make that call to a colleague if you're unsure.
Yeah, definitely. And I think it is different to picking up the phone to somebody because you do feel like you're disturbing somebody, which is very different to being in an office when you can just see somebody and say, "Hi, this has come up. Can I have your opinion on this?" So I just think if you try to build a very open culture, then it would work in almost the same way, hopefully, as if you was in the office.
This is it. On the same note, build in deputy supervisors. No doubt some firms have lost supervisors or supervisor roles have changed. Just because the main supervisor or file reviewer is off doesn't mean supervision stops. There's no excuse. Also introducing perhaps a phone a friend or a buddy system. Most firms, when they induct a new member of staff, for instance, will say, here is somebody to help and support you. Think about, do you need to have a meeting every day? Now, some firms are actually doing this. Some firms are having departmental meetings, some are having team meetings, and perhaps that's useful. And bear in mind as well, when we talk about supervision with individuals, think about how you do your file review procedure. For instance, if you had a trainee or someone very recently perhaps who qualified, the chances are, under your file review procedure, those individuals are likely to receive more frequent file reviews than somebody who has been practicing for 25 years. So perhaps you
Mm.
might consider a similar approach to deciding how the file review and supervision procedure is going to work, but also conversely bearing in mind quite often those more experienced fee earners are the ones working on the higher risk matters. Not always, but quite often. So do they need a slightly different regime, particularly on the fact that they are working remotely? And make sure as well that your reporting procedures are up to speed. So if something goes wrong, do staff know how to report it properly? Who to? What does a problem look like? How could it occur? Sometimes it's easy to see problems coming in the office, but right now we're working remotely, we're working from home. Everything's out of the norm. So are staff able to understand what bad looks like and what they need to do if they see a problem or bad coming towards them?
And that might be a training issue. I think it's quite important to consider if there are any training possibilities, whether it's for all staff or it's for supervisors to training for them to be able to do supervision remotely, especially new supervisors. If there's been changes in job roles or they're supervising new people taking on different matters with a different risk rating, it might be worth just considering if there is a training opportunity at this stage.
Very much, and keeping that under review. Do we need to, having changed things, do we need to reflect on that? Also, don't forget to review the effectiveness of supervision and management of support staff. So have a look at that, see how they're actually managed, and perhaps if you didn't have a dedicated supervision rationale, not going to say procedural policy, but rationale for support staff specifically, perhaps it's time to consider maybe one of those might be merited. Do decide what technology you're going to use to conduct supervision and file reviews, but make sure you document this, because generally speaking, this is how you're going to know, have we got the correct software? Is our software up to date? Now we're starting to creep into cybersecurity, but it's very relevant to this. But also, when we look at technology, we're thinking about how we're going to conduct file reviews and manage matters. That involves the exchange of personal data, definitely. So if you're now working remotely and conducting file reviews remotely, has that been considered in your Article 30 record? Have you mapped that? If you decide file reviews cannot be completely conducted remotely, some firms, what they're then doing is organising paper reviews to take place back in the office. And they're arranging social distancing arrangements so that on those particular days, once a month, the fee earner can come in and bring the files with them, and they can do it in a socially distanced manner. That may be the only route, but some firms are doing it and it is working. Also, maybe you could consider a substitute for a file. So perhaps, okay, that file's not available. Could we consider looking at another file from the fee earner that is available to check their work? Also, you might want to consider a piece of work review. This could be particularly useful perhaps if there's a high risk matter and you want us to see, we'll do a documented review of one particular aspect of the work to see how that's going. That could be a useful way of having to see a whole matter file.
Yeah, and I think that falls into your first top tip, Neil, actually, risk assessing your people, risk assessing your matters, and risk assessing the systems. You may be able to come up with a slightly different file review schedule for this new period where it reviews matters based on their risk rating.
Very much so. Exactly that. And it comes back to risk monitoring, doesn't it? The same applies to corrective action. So that's a challenge. You're asked to do corrective action in a file review. How do you get it back to the reviewer? Well, a lot of firms have been doing that remotely for years anyway, in terms of they've done it electronically. So it could be you update it, the new letter or whatever it is you had to do, corrective action, is put on the case management system, and you simply email the reviewer to say, hey, I've done it. If it's in paper, that's a bit more of a challenge. Could it be scanned in and put back on the central file management system, or does it need to be brought back in the following month, within 28 days, of course, to show the reviewer, so long as obviously it's not an urgent corrective action. But also something else firms have done is they've considered removing the corrective action complete portion of the file review form. This applies when we were working in offices as well. You have a file review done and you've got a record of it on the matter file and you've got a record of the review centrally. But then what happens, you do the file review. What quite often gets overlooked is the copy of the file review form on the matter file itself isn't updated to say the corrective action's been done. One or two firms have decided to remove the corrective action done bit from the file review form altogether. They have a spreadsheet back at base, and one person or two people managing that. They know when the file review is done, they know when corrective action was requested, and what they do is they monitor it. And when the corrective action is done, the reviewer reports back to that central file review monitoring coordinator and says, yes, the corrective action has been done. And there is the record that the corrective action has been done, and it is held centrally. Be sure you're reviewing your systems. Normally, we'd do a system review probably every year, some firms every 6 months. But the sand is moving from under our feet constantly. So perhaps, as well as doing the reviews we've talked about today, you should maybe review these every quarter, every 3 months, or more if you think it's necessary. Remember, the SRA expects effective supervision to take place. So are your systems still performing as they should? Are your staff still where they need to be? Have you still got capacity? And are you keeping up with risk and change?
Definitely.
We've covered so much, and
We have.
we have, and there is so much more we can do. But I think, Samantha, we're probably at the point where we have to now wrap up. So let me just direct everyone's attention briefly to the fact that we have more podcast webinars and a checklist available to you on the PDA Legal website, and more on the way. We will also be able to show you some of the other webinars and podcasts that we have available here. Samantha and I can be contacted. Our contact details are down at the bottom there. And I believe on the back of the remote working discussion, we're going to be producing our next podcast on other areas of remote working. I think we're doing that in 2 weeks' time, aren't we? So good, looking forward to that too. Thank you very much, Samantha, for joining me today. It's been a good discussion as always.
Thank you very much.
And thank you everybody for listening today. And we look forward to seeing you again very soon. Bye-bye.